Welcome everyone. Welcome back after lunch. Thank you. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed your lunch, had time to process and digest, and are back with plenty of energy for the afternoon. The attendance code is Adam, as in the name, capital ADAM, for those of you who need to register. Welcome to those of you who are joining this session as guests. It's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Michael Taylor. I have never had that before. I've just met Mike. Can I call you Mike? Yeah. Mike for the first time over Christmas lunch. Actually, it was very nice, and I'm sure you're going to have an interesting time with him this afternoon. So it's all right. I'll pray for the session and then take it from there. Yeah. All right. Let's pray. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, we thank you for the chance to be together this afternoon in December, and with Mike here to lead us in thinking and reflecting on Scripture and on the world you've made. I pray that you help us to be open to what your Spirit has to say, to wrestle, be willing to wrestle with the concepts and ideas which Mike brings, and to learn from each other. And I pray that your Spirit, as always, will guide us into your truth and your freedom. In your name. Amen.
Well, thank you all so much for coming here. This is a real privilege for me. Love to do it. Of all the kinds of preachers I've seen, the kind I like least are the ones who just stand up and talk about themselves all the time. So predictably enough, I'm going to begin by talking about myself for a bit. I don't really want to, but Martin thought it'd be helpful for you just to know a little bit about who I am, to give context to everything I'm going to say going onwards. So I am Mike. I'm married to Fiona. I have 3 sons. Shockingly and somewhat frighteningly, one of them now advises the government on housing supply policy. Talk about time going fast. I grew up in was it an atheist family or an agnostic family? I couldn't really say, but certainly no Christians in my family. At 16, I became a Christian in Brethren Church, nearby Brethren Church, which was a great place for me to become a Christian because it left me with a deep respect for the Bible and for the importance of interpretation and of digging deep into what the Bible has to say about things. So since then, for various reasons, as I've moved around between universities and jobs and so on, I found myself going to lots of different churches of different kinds, but that foundation in that church has really served me well. And along the way, I've done a lot of preaching and worship leading. And I like to be, when I'm in a church, I like to really get into that church and really be part of it. My wife is very much the same. And actually, the main frustration we have with our present church is that we can't do enough in it. Yeah. So as far as my job goes, I'm a computer programmer. That's what I'm paid to do. Back in the early 80s, I was one of those annoying teenagers who just sat cloistered in their bedroom tapping up programs and selling them on cassettes and the backs of magazines, and it's just stayed with me ever since. My degree was in maths, but as the more I did maths, the more I realised maths is really hard. And the computer science elective modules were relatively easy, so I did more and more of those. And then, for reasons I couldn't really explain at all, about the year 2000, I was in my early 30s, I suddenly got properly interested in dinosaurs. Now, I hope everybody is interested in dinosaurs as well. Yeah. Yeah. Seeing some fist pumps around the room, that's what I want. Yeah. But for most of us, that fades to some extent. For me, it just came roaring back. And at that stage, year 2000, I was on the internet, lots of mailing lists. It was mostly email then, before the web had really taken off. And I got onto the dinosaur mailing list, which was a brilliant kind of collision between professional paleontologists and interested amateurs, and that got me started reading the scholarly literature rather than just books. And after a while of reading published papers, one time I was reading a paper that was so bad I thought even I could do better than this, and it was like light bulb went on over my head. Why don't you? So I got very lucky in making a good friend who was a paleontologist, and he sent me all sorts of useful papers. Back in these days, of course, early 2000s, that wasn't emailing me a PDF. It was photocopying me 80 pages and monographic description, popping it in the post from California. So hurrah for him. And then as I started writing papers, sort of functioning as an academic paleontologist, I needed to get access to a scholarly library. And so I wrote around some universities and said, can I be an affiliate? And they also, we don't really do that. You'd have to be on a course. So I ended up kind of getting an accidental PhD just as a way of getting access to a library. And I did that by stapling 5 of my papers together and calling them a dissertation. Yeah, that all worked out. So that's that was what, 2009, and since then I've just been happily working away on my day job during the day, church things at weekends, and somehow in the bits in between there, basically researching not just dinosaurs but particularly sauropods, the biggest and the most awesome of all the dinosaurs. And with that, I'd like to just take 10 minutes to show you a tiny bit about what I work on, and then we'll start getting into the fun theological stuff. So this is a picture of me, and there's Giraffatitan branchii for scale, so you can see how big I am. That's me down by the elbow, if you missed it. This is in Berlin, the Museum für Naturkunde in Berlin. It's my single favourite museum exhibit of any kind, because this, unlike a lot of museum skeletons, is mostly real bone. And yeah, it is amazing to stand underneath that and look up at it. I'm not getting the clicker. Do you want to advance me one, please? Yep. Do I need to turn it on, maybe? I'll try. Yeah, so this is the same dinosaur. This time I'm up in here trying to measure the width of the rib cage. And I couldn't do that because my tape measure wasn't long enough. So what I had to do instead was, as you can see, I'm dropping a line to the ground, and my colleague would mark the points in each side, and then we measured across between them. I can't really overstate what an awesome animal this is, and I just recommend everybody should see it at some point. Next slide, please. Do you remember when Chris Woody used to say that during the pandemic? Next slide, please. Everyone got t-shirts with next slide. So this is younger, more handsome me, and I'm with my friend who I mentioned earlier, Matt. He's really been hugely important for helping me get up and running in this field. And next to it is the skull of the dinosaur we were looking at before. And the interesting thing about this is we think of sauropods, thank you, as having big bodies, long necks and tiny heads. And proportionally, they are tiny compared with the torso. But when you're next to one of the heads, they're not so tiny. Now, this is a publicity photo of me with my favorite single fossil in the world. So this is a mid-posterior partial dorsal vertebra of Xenophosidon pronanucos. And the reason I love it so much is because I discovered this and named it. So this is my dinosaur. When I say I discovered it, I don't mean I found it in the ground. I mean, I found it on a museum shelf. So it had been excavated in 1893 by Philip James Rufford and very, very briefly described by Lydekker, and then left on a shelf in the Natural History Museum in London, and just passed by generations of paleontologists until 113 years later, I stumbled across this, and immediately, because I've just been gazing at so many sauropod vertebrae, you know, my eyes were just locked into how they work and what they're like. So I could see that this was just something completely different. Like the way normal people have a search pattern for human faces and can tell different people's faces apart. I'm not great at that. My wife always has to tell me who's who when we're watching a film, and you know, I can't remember which one's Michelle Pfeiffer and which one's George Clooney. But I do have a great vision for sauropod vertebrae, and this thing, it's hard to make out here because it's so partial, but let me have a go. If you think about the vertebrae that make up your own backbone, We humans are weird. We stand upright. Almost everything else has a horizontal backbone. So running along here, each individual vertebra is roughly a cylinder shape with a bit that sticks up above it that covers over the neural canal, the spinal column. So this is the cylinder here, slightly broken. And this is a huge hole. Before it was broken, it would have gone at least to the top of this ceiling. Neural spine, it's called, that's above the main part of the vertebra. Lots of these bits are broken off. But sauropod vertebrae are super distinctive because of all these, you can see these flanges and sheets of bone. We call them laminae, which just means sheets. And the patterns of those and the way they fit together are super informative. So based on those and some other features, I was able to name this thing Xenoposeidon. Can anyone take a leap at what that means? No, it's a great guess because Poseidon was the Greek god of the sea, among other things, but also of earthquakes. The xeno part means alien, as in xenophobia, the fear of foreigners. So the idea is it's a kind of alien earthquake god. And the alien part of the name is because it was just such a strange shape. And I should have shown you lots of normal sauropod vertebrae first, so you could gasp in horror at how strange this one is. As I say, I love this vertebra, and this got. When this, the unannotated version turned up in, I think the Daily Mail, when this first described, one of their columnists wrote about it. I wish my husband would look at me. The way he looks at that bone. Yeah, so, and they are beautiful objects. And again, this is a different angle on the same one. You can just see the complexity of, there's lips of bone here and all sorts of holes going in different sizes. There's so much to grasp about the shape of these things. And even now, I just routinely misinterpret them after however many years it's been, 25 years of doing this. I can look at a bone and immediately think, oh yes, I see what's going on. And then realize as I look at it a bit longer, something else is happening altogether. This is another dinosaur that I named. And this one is called Brontomerus. Anybody want to take a stab at decoding that? The Bronto part, maybe someone will know from Brontosaurus.
Is the Bronto to do with its long neck?
No, it's thunder. So Brontosaurus is thunder lizard. This one had extremely large muscular thighs, and I'll show you in a minute how we knew that. So Brontomeron means thunder thighs. And that's why in the photo it's kicking this raptor out the way. We got the artist who did this to try and capture the sense that there's a power in those limbs. This is what exists of that. So unlike Xenoposeidon, it isn't just a single bone, but as you can see, it's still fairly scrappy. So this is most of the shoulder blade broken off at the end. These are some ribs, fragments of vertebrae. Who even knows what these bits are? This is the most interesting part. So this is not from the same individual as the big shoulder blade. It's the hip bone of a juvenile. And the thing it's this bone. You've got the same bone in your own body. When you stand with your hand on your hips, this is the ilium, and that's what that is. And what it's got, this bit coming out here, that's pointing forwards. So ahead of where the hip socket was this great chunk of bone that the thigh muscles were attached to. So coming right down here, very powerful thighs. Hence the name, of course, thunder thighs. It's the most distinctive thing about it. This one I've named with my buddy Matt. And one other area of our research I want to touch on super briefly, and you'll appreciate I could do this for hours, but we need to get on to the real stuff, is neck elongation and how that happens. So here we have the necks of various kinds of animal. The feeble human neck is so tiny it's hidden behind Martin. 15 centimeters. The neck of the world record giraffe, which is the longest neck of anything alive today, 2.4 meters. And after the giraffe, it's the neck longest is just 1 meter for an ostrich. There's nothing in between there. When you look at extinct animals, Paraceratherium here is a giant extinct long-necked rhinoceros. Therizinosaurus is a crazy dinosaur with long, spiky thumb claws. The Dinocyrus, Gigantoraptor, 2 more dinosaurs. And this one on the right, Aramborgiana, shockingly, is a flying animal. It's a pterosaur. Really crazy the way that feels. And you can see its neck gets as long as 3 meters. And you can see these are big animals. That's the Paraceratherium at the top. A couple of the dinosaurs at the bottom compared with the human for scale. Here's the flying reptile reconstructed to scale with a giraffe. Yeah, isn't it nuts? A thing the size of a giraffe just leaping into the air and flying away.
Actually looks quite cool.
It does look very cool. Yeah. The artist who did this, by the way, he always uses his wife as the scale bar. Okay, so those are the big animals that have these necks. Now let's compare it with the neck, the longest known sauropod neck. Here are 3.5 of its vertebrae. It just doesn't fit on the page. They are blowing everything else out the water. Here are the necks of some long-necked dinosaurs. Diplodocus at the top is the one that you've probably seen at some point in London in the Natural History Museum. And there's a bronze cast of it outside now. 6.5 meters, and you can see that Supersaurus down here at the bottom is way more than twice as long as that. They get a lot bigger, a lot longer than what you've seen. And again, to scale, here are the necks of the other longest necked non-sauropod animals that have ever lived outside of the sea. And you find yourself thinking, if you work on this stuff, how is that possible that they blasted through this 2 or 3 meter barrier that everything else stops at? If you want to know the answer in detail, you can go and read our open access paper, Why Sauropods Have Long Necks and Why Giraffes Have Short Necks, which you can easily find on Google. But the summary is this table. So as we look at all the different kind of long-necked animals that we're interested in, having many vertebrae in the neck obviously is part of it, but giraffes can't do that because they're mammals and they're genetically constrained to have 7 vertebrae in the neck. Giraffes have relatively, compared with sauropods, have big heavy heads, and that's because mammals are locked into a way of processing food where they chew extensively, so they need heavy batteries of teeth, whereas sauropods just cropped and swallowed. A large body, a large torso on 4 legs. Well, again, giraffes, they're 4-legged, but they're very long, spindly legs and relatively unstable, so not able mechanically to carry a very long neck. Air sacs, they're so exciting. Gosh, how long have we been doing for time? Can I take a digression on air sacs? Air sacs. The fittest, best trained human athletes, when they climb Mount Everest, need artificial oxygen at the top to survive at 29,000 feet, because the human lung simply cannot extract enough oxygen at that height to function. Meanwhile, birds routinely fly at that height, not just coasting, energetic flapping height. And there's a well-attested record of a vulture flying at, I think, 36,000 feet, way higher again. And the reason I say well-attested is because it actually collided with a plane. So it wasn't just someone's, oh, did I see it? Didn't I see it? How on earth are they doing that? Well, the answer is that the way birds' lungs and respiratory systems constructed is completely different from the way we mammals do it. We have stupid lungs. We breathe in and then we breathe out, and the same air just comes out, and then we breathe in, and guess what? We breathe in the same air again because it's just going in and out. So this dead end lung. Birds instead have a flow through lung, so it's fresh air running through the lung all the time. How is that done? There are air sacs ahead of and behind the lung, and they expand and contract in a way that keeps pushing fresh air through. So when birds inhale through the trachea, the windpipe, and when they exhale, both of those strokes, because of the way the air sacs are working, are feeding fresh air through the lungs. Now that's incredibly advantageous for the metabolism, as we've seen with birds flying, but also very important if you want to have a very long neck, because it enables you to overcome the problem of tracheal dead space and keep moving fresh air around inside the body. But the respiratory system is soft tissue, whereas the fossils we have in sauropods are just bones and teeth. So how can we possibly know about that? It comes down to the holes in the bone that I showed you earlier in the vertebrae. Those are analogous to similar holes that are in the vertebrae of birds and that lead to internal air spaces. And if you CT scan sauropod vertebrae, it's a hard thing to do. You know, you need friends in veterinary medicine or at a hospital and with access to a powerful scanner, and there's all sorts, and just transporting them is incredibly difficult, as I've learned myself. But if you're able to CT scan sauropod vertebrae, a thing that's been done for maybe 50 or so vertebrae in total, they all have, to varying degree, big air spaces inside the vertebrae. So for some of them, there's one or two really big spaces. For others, it's a kind of honeycomb effect with lots of really small spaces. And how those different shapes relate to each other is another focus of research. But what they have in common is that just as birds were getting air into, and indeed still are getting air into their vertebrae, sauropods are doing the same. And that indicates that they had that air sac system that gave them the flow through lung. So air sacs, giraffes don't have them because they're mammals. Mammals are such disappointing animals. And then pneumatic vertebrae are touched on already. So that's what we call it when they're full of air, pneumatic, like a pneumatic drill is driven by air. And one of the things it does, of course, is just reducing the mass of the bone, because air weighs nothing in air, whereas bone is a pretty heavy substance. So that's part of why massive vertebrae, if I had ever been able to dissect them out of a live, I was going to say out of a live sauropod, but the better idea would be out of a dead sauropod. Otherwise, it would probably object. But if I could hold up the bone and clean of all the soft tissue, it would be shockingly light compared with how big it is. Because unlike, say, a femur, which, you know, when you think of a dog with a bone, usually that's what they've got, quite a heavy thing. These vertebrae would have been very, very light. And finally, I won't go into the elongate cervical ribs because that would be another digression, but it is another feature that giraffes lack and that sauropods had. And as you look at all these other big animals that we've looked at along here, some of them have some of the features, but only sauropods have them all. And that's why sauropods have long necks and why giraffes have short necks. And again, the detail is all in the paper. So that's a kind of brief summary of the kind of research that I do. In reality, of course, most of it is just sitting at home on a laptop trying to compose sentences and use Photoshop to put images of things together. But this is the output. This also is a website I put out that may be of interest to some people, evolutionforchristians.wordpress.com, which is about not the paleontology itself. Well, I have separate websites about that, but about how it overlaps with my Christianity. So I'll leave this up in the background. These links here, svpal.com stands for sauropod vertebrate picture of the week.com. That's our blog. You might think it sounds like a silly blog. It is weirdly popular across the years. It's attracted a lot of people who love that kind of thing. And you may find something in there of interest to you as well, because it's actually much broader than just sauropod vertebrae. So that's plenty enough for me to have said about myself. And I'm now just going to start to touch on my thoughts on evolution and creation. And from here on, I should have said this earlier as well, I'm very happy to take interruptions, clarifications, questions, corrections. So if you want to chip in, please either shout out or stick up a hand. But let me just try to overview this topic. So the problem we have in the Christian world is that historically, evolution and creation have often been perceived as in opposition, that you can have one of them and not the other. And I think that mostly arises from the historical accident that when Darwin's Origin of the Species came out in 1859, some of the churchmen of the time objected to it on what they thought were valid theological grounds. And I think that started a history of conflict that isn't really warranted by the topics themselves. There are people who would like it to be a problem. Somebody like Richard Dawkins, for example, who started out as an author with a brilliant knack of explaining evolution, and has sadly over time mutated into an author who is only interested in evolution as a stick to beat Christianity with. But the flawed line of thinking that he implicitly pursues goes like this. Step one, Christians of old would look at creation and the diversity of animal and plant life and say, just imagine the amazing creator that made all these. Isn't it isn't this proof of God's existence? Step 2 is Darwin turns up with the well-formed, well-supported theory of evolution that says, actually, here is how these various forms of animal and plant came to be. Step 3 is, so that particular proof of the existence of God isn't well supported, therefore God doesn't exist. Now, when it's laid out like that, you can instantly see how completely wrong it is. All that's happened is we had a table held up by 20 legs. One of those legs, it turns out, was not carrying any weight. That goes away. The other 19 legs remain. Many, many reasons, not just for believing in God, but for knowing God and for loving God, remain in place. And that's what somebody like Dawkins actively doesn't want you to see. Other scientists have taken very different approaches. There are plenty of Christians in paleontology, for one thing. I'm not an exception in that respect, not by a long way. Stephen Jay Gould, who's probably the best known popularizer of evolutionary theory, at least before Dawkins came along, used to talk about, I don't know whether his term for this is very helpful, but the concept is, he called it non-overlapping magisteria. And what he meant by that was, magisteria is a term that means areas of teaching or of understanding. And his point was that science is teaching us certain kinds of things. Theology is teaching us other kinds of things, and they simply do not overlap. And he's absolutely right. Because when you look at the existence of the physical universe, you can ask two completely different kinds of questions about it. One kind of question a scientist would ask says things like, what exactly is this? What is glass? Why can I see through it? How did it come to be the way it is? The question, and those are interesting questions, I'm not knocking them at all. But if you're a theologian, you're asking very different questions. Who made it this way? Why did he do that? So with a scientist hat on, I can look at one thing in a particular way. With a Christian hat on, I can look at it another way. And I'm seeing things that are at right angles to each other. They're not conflicting because they're not asking or answering the same questions. Let me give you an example. Suppose you get into an argument about famous painting. Does anybody know what medium the Mona Lisa was painted in? Okay, I'm going to go with that. Thank you. Whether that's right or not, the analogy will work. Suppose I get into an argument with a friend, and we both admire the Mona Lisa for different reasons. And I say, yes, it's an amazing painting. It was painted by Leonardo da Vinci. And my friend says, aha, no, you're actually mistaken. It was painted in oils. Then you can see we're not mistaken. Neither of us are. We're both completely correct in the claim that we make about this. The claims we make are totally different from each other, but they're not at all in conflict because they're interested in different things. And in the same way, you could get a Christian and a scientist together and say, look at the universe. And one of them would say, all these different forms of animals arose through the process of evolution. And the other would say, this was created by God. And not only are they both correct, they're also not even in conflict. Does that make sense? Yeah, I love the intelligent nodding. It's always good to see. And a little hum of agreement. Okay. So science is, obviously, I think it's great because I'm a scientist, but it's a limited tool, as everything is. There are things science can help you do. If you want to build a bridge and not have it collapse when a lorry drives over it, you need a scientist. But if you want to understand love, a scientist won't help at all. All a scientist can do is tell you about like a quickening of the heartbeat or an increased amount of sweat or whatever else. And a scientist might say, yes, yes, that's what love is. And we would have to say, that's not what love is at all. That's just a physical manifestation of love. And you as a scientist can look at and understand and measure the physical manifestation. But actually you need a poet or a songwriter or someone like that to get inside what love is. And again, in exactly the same way, a scientist can tell you the age of the universe based on the distances of various objects and the wavelength of light they emit. But he can't tell you, and he's not even interested in telling you why it's that way and who made it that way. So that's why I say there's no conflict. I'm happy to take, let me say again, happy to take questions and comments. Yeah,
This one. He was quite has somewhere as like science is just observing God's stuff.
yeah.
That's all it can do, just observe God's.
Yeah, I mean, on one sense, I'd agree with that. I suppose I would also say science is much more than just observation. So it's to do with inferring what those observations tell us, making predictions based on the theory that we come up with, seeing whether future observations sustain that theory, and of course, applying all that to feels like engineering. But yeah, absolutely. Ultimately, the stuff that science works on, I would say, is all stuff that when you go back far enough, when you look at ultimate origins, is there because that's what God intended. All right, shall I talk about evolution? I shall. So that's why I'm here. Galileo, in a letter to the Grand Duchess Christina in 1615, wrote these words: I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use. Now, to me, that's a very elegant advocacy of science. The idea that among the things that God has arranged for us is that we are thinking creatures and that he intends us to use our minds just as he intends us to use our arms and legs. So with that in mind, when we look at the evidence for how things have become the way they are, not why, not by whom, but how, I would say that the evidence for evolution is extremely compelling. If you disagree, I won't necessarily try to persuade you, and I'll come back in a minute to why I think that's important. But let me just briefly say why I think it's compelling. Firstly, because it's been observed in the wild. Some famous examples would include the finches that Darwin saw in the Galapagos Islands that led him to the realization. And another much simpler one that maybe a lot of you will have heard of is the Sheffield peppered moth, which a couple of 100 years ago was a kind of pale cream color. And then as Sheffield became increasingly industrialized and there was soot everywhere and soot on all the trees, then the pale coloured moths were easily picked up by predators because they weren't camouflaged, and the darker coloured ones had a better ability to survive. And so over time, the population of that moth has become darker and darker in colour. There are plenty of examples of that. And of course, it's not just in the wild. Scientists also are interested to say, can we see evolution actually happening before our eyes in a laboratory? Well, you can't really do that with humans because it takes us 30 years to breed. You can do it with bacteria, which can have very, very short generations measured in hours or even minutes. So there have been a series of experiments done where scientists began with a population of bacteria and split it into subpopulations that subjected them to different conditions, like different temperatures, different salinity, different acidity, and so forth. And they found that there were observable changes in both the genome and the visible organism itself over relatively short periods of time, measurable in months and years. You can see these changes happening in response to the environment. Again, through natural selection, those within the population that by random variation happen to be tuned to the environment they were given were the ones that prospered, the others didn't. And the third place where you can see evolution, and the one that excites me most, of course, is in the fossil record. So you can't see the live animals there, but what you can see is a great slice through time. And the great thing about this is you can only run a laboratory experiment for a few years or decades if you're lucky. But when you're looking at the results of evolution in the fossil record, you can look through a slice of 300 million years and really see the changes accumulating. And we can, maybe if there's time later, we can look at some specific examples of that. So I see it in all these places. And because of that, over time, actually having had a brief creationist phase when I was in the Brethren Church where I first became a Christian, I have become quite convinced of the reality of evolution as a mechanism that applies in biology. But I imagine some of you will probably not be convinced, and I hope we'll have time to look into some of the reasons for that later. But what I want to say to you is not necessarily that I require you to immediately change your mind and agree with me. But what I really want is that you understand, and every creationist understand, that there are multiple fully legitimate ways of looking at these things that good, solid, honest, biblically grounded Christians accept and subscribe to. And the reason this is so important is a very practical one. Years ago, when we lived in London, my wife and I hosted an alpha, and we had a woman who came along to that, who was very ripe and ready to become a Christian and keen to, really. But she felt that she couldn't. And the reason was her parents, who were Christians and were creationists, insisted that in order to be a Christian, you must be a creationist. And she found, as she looked at the evidence, that she simply could not persuade herself that that was so. She could not deny what she saw as incontrovertible evidence of the position. And because she had been taught by creationists that to be a Christian, you must be a creationist, she concluded, I can't be a creationist, so I can't be a Christian. Now that is a tragedy. I'm pleased to say in that particular case, because she ran into us and we were the right people for her to run into, then we were able to help her through that. And she did become a Christian. And I don't know what her parents made of that. I guess that's a problem for them to deal with. But I want to say this. When we're talking to non-Christians, the heart of the gospel itself is offensive. For someone to become a Christian, they have to accept that they need to be saved. And a lot of people hate that right out the gate. And that's a legitimate difficulty. There's nothing we can do about that because that's the reality. It's a true part of the message that we as Christians are given. But what we can do is make sure we don't put up any other barriers on top of that. It's hard enough already for a non-Christian to accept Christianity. Please, let's not make it harder. Yes.
I just wanted to clarify your definition of evolution, because I think that can, I'd love to know the way that you define it, because it can mean different things. Are you defining evolution in the kind of natural selection route of things? Like in the moth, it goes from being one color gradually becoming another due to the surrounding that's in. Are you saying that, and along with that, are you including that another view of evolution where like humans came from cells that then multiplied and then became the human beings that we have now?
Yeah.
Are you looking at both of those, or one or the other? How do you view your definition of evolution?
Thank you. That's a really important, clarifying question. Much appreciated. So you'll sometimes hear people talking about microevolution and macroevolution. And some people will say the evolution of the color of the Sheffield peppered moth is an example of microevolution, small changes, but they're skeptical about large changes, like, for example, the evolution of land animals from fish. Now, when I talk about evolution, I absolutely am talking about both of those things. And the reason is because they are the same thing. That macroevolution is a lot of microevolution happening one thing after another. That they're not different in kind. So there are plenty of evolutionary scientists who will specialize in macroevolution, and they're interested in questions like how did flight evolve in birds? And there are others who will specialize on microevolutionary questions like how these particular kinds of otter diverged from each other. But they're dealing with the same mechanisms. There is nothing different happening in one case from the other. I had something else really interesting I was going to say about that. What was it? No, it's gone.
So, for examples you gave earlier, one of those was a moth that changed colour. But yeah, it was still a moth.
Yeah, that's right.
Moth. What was the other example?
Darwin's finches. So evolving beak shapes.
Yeah. Well, I guess that is. But would we still kind of classify that as a finch? Or would you?
Oh yeah. Yeah, those are both. I'll come to you in just a moment. Those are both examples of what you might describe as microevolution. The problem then is people sometimes say, well, I can believe in microevolution, but not macro. And it used to be 20, 30 years ago, people would say that and they'd follow up by saying, well, where are the examples? If macroevolution is real, where are the examples of these big transitions, like from dinosaur to bird, from fish to reptile? And for a while, it was quite embarrassing that there weren't good answers to that. And Darwin actually, in The Origin of the Species, wrote, the principal difficulty of this theory is that we don't have fossils that show these transitions. And you'll be delighted to know that just changes with the most delightful regularity now. And essentially every time someone points out a gap, fossils seem to turn up that fill it very deeply. So there have been a sequence in particular of finds from around Greenland and that sort of area, a very early, I'll come to you after, very early tetrapods, so amphibian-like animals that really do, they're almost like comically perfect as a sequence of going from a fish to a fish with loby fins to a fish with kind of fleshy fins that could crawl up on land with, to something that's a bit less like a fish, and you could trace the sequence in there. And at each stage, if you look at any given consecutive pair of those fossils, you might say, oh yeah, that looks like microevolution from one of these to one of these. When you put them all together, you've got macroevolution. Yes.
I'm trying to remember the details. Isn't it that they changed colours, but they were still the same moth, but different colours? So isn't it an example of natural selection, not evolution from one species to another?
Well, not all evolution is from one species to another. Well, natural selection is the mechanism by which evolution works, but evolution can work within a species or across species or across any level. By the way, what do we mean by species? It seems like a simple question. It's incredibly complicated. There's a paper out there that lines up 27 different definitions of the word species that have appeared in formal literature and assesses their usefulness. And in the end, the usual definition is a species is whatever a good taxonomist says it is. So there doesn't generally come a point where you can say, right, now we've crossed over a border and we did have an animal of this species and now it's of this other species. It's a species, in other words, is a helpful categorizing thing that we impose on the tree of descent, but it's not part of the tree itself. Does that make sense? Yes, please.
One thing I do subscribe to the idea of evolution. One thing I have struggled with recently is how do we get from the T-Rex to the chicken?
Oh, great. Again, do you know, I love doing this with questions because they just get to the most important things. Right, evolution works. Do we have a, thanks, raise it.
Not a very good one.
Thank you. It works in trees. So if you imagine a common ancestor, like your grandfather, and then look at two lines of descent that come from there, this family, and you can see that you resemble your cousins, but not as closely as you resemble your brothers and sisters. And if you move further back and see where the family tree spreads out further, you'll see a resemblance with your second cousins, but not as close. Now, you are not derived from your second cousin or vice versa. You share a common ancestor. That's the relation. So it isn't that one came from another. So if you've got T-Rex here, you've got modern birds here. Somewhere up here, there was a common ancestor. And that probably was something kind of like a velociraptor, at least in gross morphology. And then coming off from here, you've got lots of other branches. Some of them went somewhere, some of them didn't. And here, when you come down with birds, there are all sorts of details of the bony anatomy that are recognizably similar to things in a Tyrannosaurus, but lots of other bits that are very different. And the things that they have that are similar, the great majority of those are inherited from this common ancestor. But neither this evolved from this, nor vice versa.
That makes more sense.
Yeah. Hi.
Hi. So I'm assuming you think macroevolution takes millions of years to happen over time. So how would you reconcile, like, if you look at the Bible, the genealogies from Adam to Jesus are 4,000 years. So if you take that account, that makes Earth only 7,000 years old.
Thank you. So that leads us very neatly into the next big topic I wanted to discuss, which is how we interpret those early chapters of Genesis. Really important stuff. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to, unless it's a really quick self-contained one, I'll have to come back.
I think it's somewhat self-contained. it arguably does echo into a previous question.
Yeah.
And so connecting on to Rachel's question, then how would you take that from the detail of the ship of Theseus? This argument, which could be used to actually relate to that.
I'm familiar with the ship of Theseus.
Yeah, on the applying on the detail of species over the generations.
Yeah.
And part of it. Yeah, I'm trying to think better about the English question.
I mean, it's certainly true that through the long line of descent from early ancestors, huge amounts of an organism get replaced. But there's still shared genetic material between you and a houseplant.
Yeah.
That's kind of weird, but that's how it is.
I mean, I think it's about 50%, there's maybe 70% for like a banana.
I wouldn't want to, genetics isn't my thing, so I'm not going to comment on particular numbers. But let's then think about how do we read the early chapters of Genesis? Because this really is the key thing I wanted to land on. So again, I want to emphasize, although I am convinced of the reality of evolution, my goal is not to persuade you that I'm right about this. My goal is to help us to think clearly about the early chapters of Genesis, what they're for, what they're not for, and what they're teaching us. So, Theory of Evolution was published in 1859. 1600 years before that, just checking my numbers, 1400 years before that, in 400 AD, St. Augustine wrote a book called The Literal Interpretation of Genesis. Very helpful. And his point was, well, let me quote, at least we know that the Genesis creation day, is different from the ordinary day with which we are familiar. And his conclusion, drawn long before any kind of evolutionary theory, was that probably what was written in those early chapters of Genesis was not intended to be a literal account of what happened in what order and in what period of time. And his conclusion was that, in fact, he thought probably God created everything just like that in an instant, and that what's given to us in Genesis is to help us understand God's character and his nature. Now, obviously, I now, with the benefit of 1400 years of, 1600 years of further understanding of the sciences, I would have a different position from Augustine on how God created the universe. But I share with him the sense that Genesis was not intended to be a literal textbook. And of course, the other thing I have in common with Augustine is the conviction that however God created the universe, he did, and he did it deliberately and for purpose. So, Genesis, I would say, is not intended to be a science textbook. That was not an idea that would even have been on the radar at the time that the words were written down. I guess Moses was traditionally considered the author of Genesis, right? Traditionally. I mean, you're the Old Testament expert. But definitely it would have been around the right time for Moses to have been the author. So we're looking at thousands of years BC.
Yeah, it's complicated.
I'll accept it's complicated.
But I say it's written sometime between Moses and the post-exilic period.
Oh, what's that? All right. Never mind specific dates. The point is this. At the time that those words were written down, it would not have been in the author's mind, be he Moses or someone else, that the purpose of it was to communicate science. Science was not really an idea that even existed. In fact, the earliest example I can think of in the Bible where you get something that maybe is a little like science is Solomon cataloguing the plants and animals. But even then, a mere cataloguing is only, as we discussed earlier, is only the very beginning of science. So that's not what the author of Genesis was trying to do, I would argue. And you may say, and some people do say, but we should always attempt to interpret the Bible literally, or as literally as we can. And I have some sympathy with that perspective, which again is something I hope we can come back to later. But I would say it simply cannot be applied to Genesis. It doesn't work. Let me give you an example. If we say we need to interpret the days of Genesis as literal days at the time in which the sun rises and sets and comes around to rise again, that's what a day is, right? But the sun doesn't get created until day 4 of the Genesis account. So for the first 2 or 3 days, you simply cannot measure the length of a day. It's literally meaningless to argue that the first few days of Genesis were days as we understand that literally. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm seeing a shaking of the head. I'm happy to take a disagreement.
If God is creating a day which we've decided is 24 hours, he could use that same timing even before you have the sun. So like God is outside of time and can create that time. He's not bound by time.
Right.
But we could have the same timings for the past 3 days as we have when the sun's actually created.
Right. I would classify that idea as not impossible, but implausible with the character of God as we know him. So you're absolutely right that there's nothing that means God could not have set it up that way if he chose to. But what would be in it for him to decide in advance that a certain duration of time was going to be special, to do things in this period, and then set up the suns go around the earth in that period of time? So I don't think what you're suggesting is silly, but can I say I just don't buy it? I don't feel that what I understand of God's character just doesn't seem like a good fit. Does that make sense? Thank you for bearing with me on that. Giving you a moment to think about this. Yes, go ahead.
Just on the back of that, like, if I remember being inside the class when I was in years 10 or 11 with it, the way that the Genesis story is written, whether you take it literally or not literally, the order in which he created things, actually, when you look at the science, I don't have time to go like into all the scientific things, but if you look at the order of it, like, it actually matches up remarkably well with the science of the creation of the world. Like, you had to have the water for the CO2 to be the right balance and everything for all the vegetation to be created and everything.
Yeah, I'm afraid it doesn't. I have heard that idea, but you have things like animals before plants, and the earth before the sun. So it even interpreted in a broad way, it's not really a good match for scientific understanding. Yes.
If you're going with the idea that the first few days might be a longer period, why would the writer use the exact same language of morning and evening first day, the first few days, and then the same for after when the sun and moon was created? But if they would distribute specifically different lengths of time, why would they use the exact same language of day and night?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very difficult question to answer. The only answer I can give to that is poetry. But let me ask you an equally difficult question. What on earth can the author have meant by literally saying morning and evening the second day? What was the sun?
Supposed to do it in that time room. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's possible. I mean, an extreme version of this idea, I don't know whether some of you have heard of this, is that the universe is not 15 billion years old, as people think, but 6,000 years old, and light that appears to be reaching us from stars that emitted it billions of years ago is photons that God deliberately placed in that position to be coming towards us in such a way as to make it look as though those stars were there and are that old. Anybody heard that idea? Yeah, so that, again, I would classify as, could God do that? Yes. Would God do that? I don't think so. I mean, that's basically saying God has made the whole physical universe a lie to trap us. Why would God do that? So I think we have to sort of take the universe at its word, if you like. There's an old Catholic idea, the phrase I think is all truth is God's truth. And the idea is whatever you discover, if it's true, then it's true because God willed it to be true. And I don't buy the idea of God setting things up to deceive us. Now, again, I can't prove that scientifically. Arguably, I can't even prove it theologically. But I think when we look at everything we understand about God's character from the Bible as a whole, it just doesn't fit. You've had your hand up for quite a while.
I hear what you're saying. Everything that God creates, the moment he creates something that we can observe.
Yeah. Well, and actually, the reason I'm interrupting there is because when we're talking about things like distant stars, that's not true. It takes billions of years before we can observe those because the light has to travel.
So the example. So say God created a rock.
Yeah.
And he put us on the clock.
Mm.
When we observe that rock, although God has just created that rock, if I was to observe that rock in old data, say, 2 million years old, even though God's just created that rock that is aged, has the appearance of, God has just created that rock. And we can observe it, but the truth is God's just created. I wonder if the example that you gave of the light, years away.
To me, that's an example of the same proposition, that could God set things up to look as though they were different from how they are? Yes, he could. Would he? I don't think so. Do you think that's how God would operate?
No, yes, so just put it back. I don't think that God is setting it up so the way that it's different, that it is. In the same way as that. I don't know that I'd say that's God particularly being deceitful.
I mean, you don't know that I am as I appear to be 57 years old. Maybe I was just born this morning and God brought me into being at this apparent age, and I'm standing here looking like I am. And again, could he do that? Yes, but I promise you he didn't. And I think we're looking at a similar kind of thing here. I'm sorry, I need to move on because there's so much to cover, but thank you. I do appreciate you raising this. You had your hand up.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Taylor. Just 2 questions. Number one, I think there was a paleologist in Germany called Gunter Beckley.
Mm-hmm.
I think they questioned the whole issue about their transitional fossil record from the viewpoint that they said essentially it doesn't support evolution. And their point was that you see in the fossil record what they refer to as these explosions or abrupt appearances. But their assertion was that in over 160 years of discoveries, that we haven't found any coherent evidence of slow, gradual transition from one fossil or one form to another. How do you answer that?
Yeah, that is basically a sampling problem. So early in the history of paleontology, you would just dig where there happen to be exposures. So you might have a 50 million year gap between this quarry that you had access to and this one. And then, of course, you've got these big gaps between them. But as the ability to correlate the ages of different formations has improved, and as more fossils have been sampled from intermediate regions, that idea has really lost pretty much all of its weight. There are loads of examples of slow change through time.
When you say loads, could you expand on that?
Well,
I'm not asking you for figures, but
I mean, I only work on dinosaurs myself, so I know. I kind of pick up background radiation from other fields, but things like sequences of different chasmosaurine ceratopsians in Alberta going through relatively slow change of hundreds of thousands or maybe million years at a time. And you can see a sequence of, we classify them as different species, but they look like they're probably the same lineage just going through a process.
Okay. Can I come back to you with something else quickly?
Yes.
So we do one more and then we'll take a break.
Yeah. Where are we up to time-wise? Oh gosh.
Yeah.
Okay, so then I'll come back to interpreting early Genesis in the second half.
Yep.
Final question for now then.
Yeah. Am I right in saying there's an assumption in science, essentially, that proceeds on a methodology of naturalism, which in essence generally explains natural phenomena, by natural causes. So in other words, the premise of science ordinarily is to de-supernaturalize anything. There's no supernatural explanations that science can explain. So the incarnation, the bodily resurrection of Jesus, etc. As Christians, we would accept that those, I presume, even though science would say there is no rational, reasonable scientific explanation of that. And this is my question really, is that I think Claire alluded a second ago about why, and your question was, why would God leave an appearance of age in the earth if the age isn't old? I have no issue that the age is old, but when Jesus turns the water into wine, if you were to taste that wine immediately afterwards and ask the question, how old is a wine? The answer would not be a minute.
No, okay? That's great.
And I think the thing is, Dr. Taylor, is that what we have to be careful of is taking God out of the picture.
Yeah.
And I absolutely respect the fact that you're not seeking to do that, and you're seeking to reconcile those two things. But I think that there is an explanation that God could have done things, and I believe did do things in that supernatural, miraculous way outside of an evolutionary explanation. Because I think Scripture later testifies that the very fact that our Christianity is a miraculous religion.
Yeah.
So sorry, I've thrown a lot at you there, so forgive
That's
me.
quite a long question, but let me fundamentally say I very much agree with you. I hope no one's going to go away from this thinking I'm arguing Christianity is not miraculous. The whole point of the miraculous is that it's not something that can be studied by science. It's the exceptions that against the backdrop of science. So dead bodies do not come to life. And that's why it's shocking that Jesus raised Lazarus. Women who haven't had sex don't have babies. And that's why it's amazing that there was a virgin birth. And it's amazing to me when supposedly intelligent atheists will say something like, oh, those fools back in the New Testament days didn't even know that women don't have babies without having sex. They knew perfectly well, and it's right there in the text. Mary says, how can this be when I'm yet a virgin? She knew that what was happening was not scientifically explicable. She wouldn't have expressed it in those terms, but that's why it's a miracle. So if I can finish this half by talking about what science properly does and doesn't do. You mentioned the idea of there being a presupposition among scientists that everything is naturalistic. I would say that when science is done right, that's not quite correct. What it is instead is that the domain of science is the naturalistic. So what you study scientifically is what happens naturally. When something happens that isn't natural, science can't address it. So there have been philosophers, I think Hume maybe was one of them, who said that miracles don't happen because they can't happen, which is just, I mean, it's terrible circular reasoning, but it's the kind of, I think C.S. Lewis used the phrase scientism to mean science, but sort of making a religion of science and making it an axiom that only naturalistic things happen. But actually that's no part of science itself to make that assertion. The proper part of science is to say something that is not part of the natural world, I can't study with scientific methods. And it is true, some scientists have violated that gap to nobody's advantage. So thank you for bringing that up.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's get, thanks. Let's take a break. Some of us might need a strong coffee. We'll start back at 25 past on the dot to be realistic. Okay, and then we'll bring more of your questions, and obviously Dr. Taylor will continue. Thank you.
Yeah, 25 minutes.